The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Cyril, for this nice introduction, and thank you very much for having me. I think I'm widening the field even more, and I'm bringing diet and nutrition into the play or into the game today. But I would like to span the story a little bit, why nutrition and why in this framework. And I took the liberty to take a picture from the PhenoRob website. I hope that's fine, showing what PhenoRob does, and it also says it here. It's for sustainability, robotics and phenotyping for sustainable crop production. And one of the buzzwords that is here is decreasing the environmental footprint of agriculture with less input of chemicals, and it is about food. So in the end, all of these efforts, we have food, and food feeds into human diet, and this is where nutrition and nutritional epidemiology comes into play, because we are the ones that are interested in human diet and associations of human diet with human health. And that's why I think this is also a topic that fits nicely into the frame of this seminar series today. The seminar today. Now, when we're thinking about chemicals, the one thing that you could think of is maybe that you have effects on food constituents if you change crop production, and then maybe you can think about food safety, secondary plant compounds, organic foods, and things like this. Which would then have an effect on physiology or pathophysiology of disease occurrence. But this is not what epidemiology does. But we take the broader picture. We focus on dietary patterns. What are the overall dietary patterns in populations? And Cyril already mentioned that this is one of our research foci in our department, and the effects on chronic disease prevention in populations, so on the larger scale. And I want to go a little bit back to one of the definitions, or I think the still present definition of sustainable diet. This definition goes back to the year 2012 and has a number of aspects in there, and I would like to cite this definition. So sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts, I think that's obvious and that everybody thinks about, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life. So here disease and disease prevention comes into play for present and future generations. And when we go a little bit down, sustainable diets are protective and respectful for biodiversity, ecosystems, culturally accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resource. So we think that in the definition of sustainable diets, human health plays a big role also. So, and the other area that I want to talk about today is epidemiology, because this is the kind of methods that we do. We do epidemiological research. And what does epidemiological research do? Epidemiological research describes occurrence of diseases in populations, but it also looks at determinants. And what are the determinants? You might think of determinants as risk factors for diseases. And you might all know that the intake of red meat, for example, increases the risk of colorectal cancer. At least I hope that you all know that, because this is one of our the messages that we want to bring across. But we look at risk factors for diseases in populations, and we have some kinds of study designs. And I put that in bold red here also, that because this is what I want to talk about, analytical studies where we bring risk factors and disease occurrence together. And this is what we want to do also when we think about sustainability of diets, dietary patterns that are sustainable, and do they link to health on a population level? The question is, does adherence to a dietary pattern, to a sustainable dietary pattern, also relate to disease occurrence and decreases your risk of developing ischemic heart disease, stroke, or any kind of chronic diseases? This is one of the epidemiological questions that we could do we could answer with our methodology. So what do the studies look like that we do? This is just one example of cohort studies, but it's a study design that is a very powerful design, where we can really link these exposures, these dietary aspects, to disease occurrence on an individual basis. And let me run you through this picture of a cohort study. You can see a time axis here. And we have a baseline assessment. So we recruit a large group of study participants. And to give you an example, there is a new cohort study that is currently set up all over Germany. There's no no recruitment center in Bonn, so probably none of you is a member of this cohort study, but the size is 200,000 participants, to give you an idea. Yeah? So this is the order of magnitude that we are talking about, yeah, when we want to really conduct these studies. And we start with some exposure assessment. That means we want to assess all the risk factors, including a dietary assessment, where we want to get to know about what do all the participants in the study eat. And then we have an assessment over time, where we collect information of incident diseases, and the incident diseases are the newly occurring ones. So newly occurring diabetes type 2, cancer, ischemic heart diseases, all the ones that are the major burden of diseases in the population. And the time axis is years. Yeah? So the study goes over years. We have cohort studies where we have a lot of information from nowadays. They started in the 90s and they are still ongoing. So they are really long-term studies, really long-term investments. And then in the end, what we compare is we have groups of individuals. We call it with exposure, so maybe those that led a sustainable diet, and compare these to those that did not have the exposure, where the diet was maybe not so sustainable or with a larger environmental impact, and compare disease incidence, so diseases occurrence. And when we think there's a factor that is preventive for disease, then we would have less cases here compared to the cases here. And that is the basic description that we do. So what we need to do this is we need to have an assessment of dietary intake, and this is crucial to nutritional epidemiology, and it's really not trivial. So we need to know what the people have eaten. And we have certain kinds of instruments. This is an example of a food frequency questionnaire. You don't need to read it. And it's a question you have to picture. It's about 100 food items, and the study participant is asked, for example, how often on average over the previous year did you eat tomatoes? Or one tomato, and then the participant can answer once per day or something like this. It's a rough instrument, but it's very informative, because we know that the frequency of intake of foods is very descriptive for the variation of food intake in the population. And they are brief questionnaires that take like 20 minutes to complete. When you think about 200,000 participants, you have to think about something that is doable. So this is one area, or this is one means of collecting the information. You can use them web-based. We have other instruments. This is a smartphone-based assessment instrument. It's a dietary protocol. It's more a short-term instrument, asking the participant to keep track of all the diet, of all the foods he eats, and the leftovers during a certain amount of period of time, 1 day, 2 days. Maybe some of you use MyFitnessPal, or all kinds of apps are out there nowadays, that are kind of record types, where you have very, very, very detailed information about the specific food eaten, and not just overall groups. And this is also a type of instrument that we can use. Or other also newer developments. It is a retrospective instrument asking about what did you eat yesterday. So we have just 1 day, but also very defined. And maybe we have also one picture-based food record. Where we work with pictures. That can also be used in studies. So why am I talking about this? The thing is that in the end, we want to assess the sustainability of diet. So we have this individual level dietary information in more or less depth, and we want to know how sustainable was this. And when we think, so we have foods on the consumption level, on the level of food groups or food items, so fruit and vegetables, but we also know about the apple, and we sometimes also know about the apple if it was eaten with the peel or without the peel, and if it was cooked or not cooked, and if it was organic or not. And we all, depending on the instrument, we do have this information. And when we use questionnaires, we have something like between 100 and 300 items or something, depending on the type of questionnaire. But when we go to the more detailed instruments, we have items more than 1,000 for each participant, depending on what period we used. Or what period we assessed the data. And then you have to think about the general food commodities in the production. Like grain are different from what is eaten in the end. And it's from a health perspective very different if you eat a whole grain bread that came from grain produced, or if you eat a cookie in the end. So we need the level of actually consumption that is interesting for us to do our analysis. So what do we do in our further analysis? We can of course look at nutrients and food groups, and that's probably very familiar. But when we look into sustainability and sustainable diets, we look into dietary patterns, and that's why I want to bring that up. Yeah. We have two basic methodologies. We have hypothesis-driven dietary patterns, and you all know, for example, the Mediterranean diet. It's a hypothesis-driven dietary pattern because there's a certain assumption about what a Mediterranean diet is, and then you have a dietary assessment instruments, and people get a score if they have a moderate consumption of red wine, and they maybe don't get a point if they eat too little fruits and vegetables. So you have an assumption, a hypothesis, where you allocate people then to afterwards. And on the other hand, we can have exploratory dietary patterns where we really search in our data and try to find the patterns. And the so-called Western diet that some of you might know, high in saturated fats, is originated from such an exploratory analysis. In the end, what do we do with our research results? We try to elucidate the evidence, try to find the evidence between dietary intake and disease outcome, and come up with food-based recommendations in the end. And that's why I put the food guide pyramid of Germany from the German Nutrition Society up here to give you an idea, because the studies we do feed into these results, for example. So coming back to sustainability, how can we bring sustainability into this picture? And there are basically two ways of thinking about sustainability in individual diets and analyzing these in nutritional epidemiological context. Yeah? What has been done in the literature so far. So the one thing is we try to really assess sustainability aspects of individual diets and then use these to describe the environmental impacts of diets. We can also link these in our study designs with disease risk. To close the gap again, to really analyze if these sustainable diets or those diets with low environmental impact are also good for human health. And the other way around is we can use hypothesis-driven dietary patterns. So we can try to calculate the adherence to patterns of sustainability if we have an hypothesis about a sustainable dietary pattern, and then associate these with disease risk in our studies. And there has been a literature review in the year 2016 about epidemiological studies that use sustainability aspects in their studies to assess sustainability of diets. And they put up this framework, and this goes back to the definition that I showed you on the third slide, from 2012, where all the different aspects of sustainable diets are included. The health aspects, the social aspects, and all the ecological, I would say environmental aspects. And I think this is what we mostly think about, that is associated with the foods that we eat, the land use, the water use, the energy use, the soil health, and biodiversity, and some of it we've heard before. And how has it been used in studies? So in the end, these authors find 113 empirical studies, so quite a number, that use sustainable, or try to picture and calculate sustainable diets. However, approaches have been very heterogeneous, and for at least 71 studies, greenhouse gas emission of total dietary patterns, not single food items, have been used. This was the most prominent indicator used. All greenhouse gas emissions via life cycle assessment have been used in studies. And some of the other indicators used were energy consumption, climate change, and some more. What was also interesting, I think, is that we can also think of determinants of consumer choice and value systems and attitudes and things like this to research sustainability. Now, anyway, I want to go back to these life cycle assessments. So, and some researchers have already composed databases where we can link single food items to such life cycle assessment information. And this is a database, I think it comes from Wageningen University, if I remember correctly. And they put together a database with information on greenhouse gas emission and land use for about 900 different food items. They are collapsed here in this table 2 food groups. So they have 139 food items as eaten in a survey, in survey or as assessed in dietary assessment instruments belonging to the group of grains and grain-based products with individual, in the end, information on greenhouse gas emission and land use associated with this food item as eaten. And this is one of the, I think, first databases that are out there, that are freely out there for nutritional aspects. I know one further from the US, but it's very difficult for the nutritionist to collect this data really on the commodity of the food as eaten. But this database gives us the opportunity to link it to the dietary assessment instrument. And this is actually what the authors have done. I don't want to read you to read all the complete table, but what they looked at is they looked at survey data from 4 European countries that use the dietary assessment instrument. I've shown you before the food records and the 24-hour recalls, and then they calculated the contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and to land use for certain food levels. And just to give you a picture here, so they calculated for Denmark that for animal sourced foods they contribute to about 29% to energy intake, about 64% to greenhouse gas emissions, and about 67% to land use. Whereas the plant-based foods contribute to 60% of energy and only 90% to greenhouse gas emissions and 25% to land use. This is not new, so the information in the end is not new, that animal-based products are kind of worse for the environment. However, the approach they take is new because they use this individual level data on individual level diets. We have modeling system for whatever vegetarian diets that take population groups, but for using the individual level data, I think this is a very new approach, and I'm not aware of a study right now leading this now to disease risk, which I think is a very obvious next step. One example of the alternative, you might be familiar with the planetary health diet. Some of you might have heard about it. There was a huge press coverage at the beginning of 2019 where Walter Willett and Johan Röckström populated this so-called Eat Lancet diet. So they constructed a dietary pattern that would allow everybody in the world to have a healthy diet and keep the planetary boundaries of biodiversity loss and climate changes and all kinds of things. And when you look at it, here is the details of the diet. You can see the food groups: whole grains, tubers and starchy vegetables, fruit, dairy, and so on. And when you look at it with a nutritionist point of view, you can see that it's in general what we think is a healthy diet, but there are some very interesting things in there. For example, it does allow you 0% of energy from whole grains. And as a nutritionist, we would always say whole grains is kind of mandatory and you should prefer whole grains. And on the other hand, it shows you, for example, an upper limit of vegetable intake. I think most nutritionists would never say there's an upper limit of vegetable intake, but to feed the planet, that's the idea behind it. So there are some specifics about it, and also maybe meat. Very low amount of red meat is allowed, so you can be vegan or vegetarian following this diet, but you can also be flexitarian and omnivores. And they put a strong emphasis, you can see it on legumes, so on the plant-based protein sources. And here actually are the nuts that we had this morning. And they don't have a range, but they say 25 grams of nuts. It's not the salted nuts, but it's the tree nuts that are recommended as a plant-based protein source. So it's a healthy diet in a way, what we think is a healthy diet, but it has some peculiarities about it. And indeed, there is one epidemiological study that transferred this one to a hypothesis-driven dietary pattern. So there's a study, it's called the EPIC Oxford study. It's about 25,000 study participants in the UK, and they have a baseline assessment of diet in the 90s, and they have followed up their study participants for disease occurrence until, well, it's still ongoing. And what they did is they pictured mirrored this index or the diet that I showed to their dietary assessment information. So people that adhered to that diet got with strong adherence, they calculated 14 different points. I'm not going to run you through this, but they calculated 14 different points. So the people in the cohort that strongly adhered to this dietary pattern, so that we would say lead a sustainable diet, scored 14 points, and those that did not adhere to this diet at all scored 0 points. And then we have a variation in the population. And what they then did, they associated these scores, and you can see them here, with incident diseases in their population. We have the lower areas, so these were the groups of study participants that scored 4 to 9 points in comparison here to 12 to 14 points. So there were also participants that scored 14 points on the scale. And this, what you can see here, is the relative risk. So when we want to interpret this, it means that study participants that adhered to this dietary pattern had an about, let's say, 28% decreased risk of developing ischemic heart disease over these 20 years of follow-up, in comparison to those that only slightly, 4 to 9 points, adhered to this dietary pattern. And they showed really nicely, so it's kind of from the other way around, they showed really nicely that this sustainable diet was in their study associated with disease. You can see it with ischemic heart disease, with diabetes, and also slightly with all-cause mortality. They did not find an association with stroke. And this is the first study that I know that did that. I don't know any other study, but I think when I see this, I think that is what we need to do in nutritional epidemiology, to take care of these sustainable diets and approaches to really close this loop, and really then investigate if sustainability or diets with low environmental impact also are associated with low disease or decreased disease risk. So to summarize, I would like to make that point that I think nutritional epidemiology has the means to investigate dietary risks on health outcomes in population-based settings, and this can be also transferred to sustainability aspects of diets. However, the assessment of sustainability in individual diets, this is the missing link, this is the important and very difficult thing. Another point is sustainable diets have thus far been most often reduced environmental impacts. This goes back to this definition where also social impacts are, or social characteristics play a role. But I think also in this context, environmental impacts are the most important things. Only few studies have investigated the associations with disease risks thus far. There is a lot more to do, and I think the first step, the first thing to do is actually work on the food composition data, to link it to life cycle assessment data that is only limitedly available nowadays, or thus far, or the other way around would be to work on those hypothesis-driven dietary patterns, where we'll be a little bit faster with, I would say. And with this, I would like to close, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your talk, Ute. We have time for questions.